Hey guys, welcome to the first ever episode of Show Don't Tell. My name is Pan and I am a videographer and filmmaker. I live in London in the UK, and I've basically been meaning to start this channel for like ages now. So I'm really excited to finally get the chance to start it, and I'm looking forward to teaching you guys all about things I know about film and video. Some of it will be practical, some of it's theoretical, but I think a mixture of both is important. The expression show don't tell means basically show me what you're trying to say. Don't just use dialogue expositionally. So this episode is going to be about 6 very important camera functions, or 6 things you need to know about as a beginner videographer or filmmaker to elevate your ability to shoot better videos, really. Those 6 things are: number 1, shutter speed; number 2, the aperture; number 3, the ISO; number 4, frame rate; number 5, your white balance; and finally number 6, your resolution. So before we get going, please do press the subscribe button. Do like the video if you found it interesting and of use. And of course, do press the bell icon so that you can be informed whenever I make a new video, so that you can be the first there. Or you don't have to be the first there, obviously. You can do what you want. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is shutter speed. So what is shutter speed? Every camera has a sensor, right? So that's almost the camera's eye, or the camera body's eye. And the shutter basically is almost like its eyelid. Okay, so if you shut your eyelids, you're blocking light from coming in, so no light will come in. But if you open it, light comes back in. So the shutter speed is important because depending on how long it stays open, or how quickly it shuts, depending on those things, then you can get slightly different results. Especially for video, it's very important, depending on your frame rates, what your shutter speed should be, because as opposed to photos that you can get a bit away with it, shutter speed really influences the motion blur in video. So if I'm going like this, for example, right, there's X amount of motion blur, so that's how blurry motion looks. Okay, so the quicker the eyelid or the shutter closes, right, the less blur you're going to have, because it took the image so quickly that it didn't allow for the chance to see much blur. So the more open that is, the more you can see blurry things. And if you look into photography as well, and we will be doing more on photography as time goes, because I think it's very relevant, and I too know quite a bit about photography. So you'll learn these things more. So basically 1/50 tends to be the normal for Europe, and 1/60 would be in America if you're doing 30 frames. So yeah, and if for example you were to shoot 1/200 or 1/3, 4, 500, this is really going to play a role on your motion blur. Some people do that because they want certain things. If you're doing a product video and you don't want as much motion blur on something, you might sort of have a very quick shutter speed. That way you don't see that motion blur. So number 2 now is aperture. So your aperture is basically almost kind of similar to the shutter speed, because it's the eye of the lens, while the shutter speed's almost the eye of the sensor of your camera. Some people could call aperture iris, so how open your iris or how closed it is. I call it aperture, and aperture works through f-stops, right? So the lower your f-stop number, so say you're at f1.8 or f2.2, that's quite a low number, and it means your iris, your lens is quite open, so it's letting a lot of light in. While if you're at something like f10, f15, f20, the eye of the lens is closing down quite a lot, so it's not allowing as much light in. And when this happens, this can determine a few things. One very important thing to know is that the lower your f-stop is, i.e. the more open your lens is to allow more light in, the more shallow depth you are going to get. Shallow depth of field, that is. Depth of field is very important. So depth of field is basically the distance that the depth of your shot is in focus, right? So for example, right now, I'm on f2.8 for this, so the background behind me might be a bit more blurred, although I'm not too far from the background. So if, say, the background was way behind me, it'd be a lot more blurred. But say I was on f20, it would be quite in focus, the background. So the more open your lens is, the more shallow your depth of field is. And the more closed your lens is, i.e. letting in less light, the more in focus, a lot more things are going to be in the depth, okay? So a lot of people sometimes call shallow depth of field just depth of field, but that's not correct. Depth of field is just how long is the distance that is in focus, really, in a nutshell. Shallow depth is what you mean when you talk about someone's background being out of focus, or how much more blurry can you make that out of focus. And of course it also works with your background can be in focus and the foreground can be out of focus, so it works both ways. In a nutshell, that is what what the iris or the aperture is. So very important. Now, one more thing I'm going to say to you guys is be very, very careful when you have a lot of light, i.e. when you're outdoors or when you're just in a room that has a lot of light and you don't have filters. That can really be a bit, you've got to be a bit careful with that, because basically if you don't have a filter, an ND filter, which is going to block some of the light from coming in, and say you're shooting at something like f15 or f12 or things like that, or even f20, that can be a problem, because basically your detail starts to be destroyed a bit. Okay, so your sharpness becomes a bit less and things like that. So I would say you don't really want to ever go over f10 really, because then that really starts to affect things. But yeah, the lower f-stops on your lens is where you want to be. And usually the sharpest point, i.e. not the most focused point, the sharpness is how detail, how clear, how sharp it is, right? Is usually a few stops into the lower parts of your lens. So say this lens of mine is f2.8 at its lowest point, then sort of around f4 is going to be, there's a lot of sharpness, but also the range at which it's quite sharp is also probably, up to f8, f9 and things like that. It's still quite sharp. But then when you start going over f10, because you're not allowing much light in, that begins to destroy your sharpness. So you know, be very, very careful with that. So if you're doing f2.8, f1.8, you always will need filters, especially outdoors where there's an abundance of light, and you won't get away with it, or else it's going to force you to make your shutter speed go to like 1/500 or 1/1000, and you really don't want that, because when you're exporting your videos in the edit, you are going to start getting really, really strange motion blur kind of aberrations and things like that. So you don't want that. So yeah, that's sort of shutter speed in a nutshell. So number 3 is the ISO. Now, I do have to say, when it comes to ISO, we're quite lucky these days. And in fact, we've been lucky for, I don't know, a good 20 years since cameras started going digital, unless it's a bit longer than that. But why are we lucky with that? Because back in the day, when video used to be through film, actual film stock, you had to basically order your film stock to be a certain ISO. That means how sensitive it is to light, okay? So ISO is basically a third way to be able to control how much exposure goes into your camera, because it makes it more sensitive. And these days we're extra lucky as well, because cameras are becoming more and more light sensitive, which means that they're basically they don't get as much grain when you really push into the ISO. Cameras like the Sony a7S II, a7S III, a lot of the newer Panasonics, Canons, whatever it might be, a lot of them can really push into the ISOs these days. But back in the day, you know, if you were to go over sort of with newer digital cameras, if you were to go even beyond ISO 1600 or ISO 1000, whatever, you'd start seeing a lot of grain. So that's why we're very lucky. So ISO is important as well. Do keep in mind, a lot of cameras have what is called native ISO. Some of them even have dual native ISO. So native ISO is basically the ISO amount on your camera which will have the least amount of grain on it. Okay, so if, say for example, your camera's native ISO is 3200, it's basically telling you that's where you want to be with the ISO to get the least amount of grain. Some people like to keep their ISO there and then just do everything else to the camera. So put filters on, block light, you know, do the lens, the iris, whatever it might be, to make sure they stay on that ISO. But you know, when it comes to doing quicker work, like say you're doing events or you're doing weddings or you're doing, you know, things where you don't have much time, then you're never going to really stay on the ISO. And because you can go lower or a bit higher even, and it's still not that grainy, then you'll definitely get away with it. Yeah, so the ISO is important. It's how sensitive you kind of make your sensor to light kind of thing. And yeah, it's not set anymore, so we can go anywhere from 100 to hundreds of thousands, and you'll be fine. But be very careful, don't push too much into it sometimes, because you will start seeing that grain. Right, so point number 4, frame rate. So I did already speak about these a bit during the shutter speed topic, but frame rates are quite important when you're shooting. It can determine a lot of things. So as I said, Europeans, they tend to use 25 frames per second because electricity is distributed in these countries at 50 Hertz, while in America they tend to use more 24 or 30 frames per second because in America electricity is distributed at 60 Hertz. And if you actually, for example, if you're shooting 25 frames a second and you have a source of light which really was built for 60 Hertz, so for America, you start seeing really bad flicker sometimes. Or have you ever shot a monitor and you saw this really ugly flicker, or there's a projector or something like that, and you're thinking, oh, why is it doing that? Well, it's usually doing that because the output of the electricity that's running through that source of light is the incorrect one to what your camera is running. And that could be similar, I guess, in effect, if you're shooting 30 frames or 24, if you're in America and you're shooting something from Europe, then that can also have flicker. So the correct thing to do is, if you do see flicker, then you should technically change your frame rate basically to have that. You can shoot in 25 frames and then force a slow motion in the edit, which people do, and it's fine, but it won't look as good as if you shoot in a higher frame rate. And of course, you can shoot 100 frames a second, you can shoot 200 frames a second. If you're in Europe, if you're in America and you're doing say 24, 30 frames a second, then you'll be going 60 frames, 120, 240, 480, etc. So what is very important though when it comes to shooting these higher frame rates is your shutter speed must then be at the right place. So at 25 frames per second, you want your shutter speed to be 1/50, because as I said earlier, this gives you the right motion blur. If you are doing 24 frames per second, then 1/50 will still be okay for you, because I think the next step down from 1/50, I believe, is 1/40. So yeah, I don't think you'll get away with that. So 1/50 is fine for 24 frames. However, 30 frames per second, then you need to go to 1/60. And then basically you can kind of see the relationship. So whatever your frame rate is, you want your shutter speed to be twice that. 25 frames is 1/50. 50 frames is 1/100. 100 frames is 1/200, etc. If you're in America, 1/30, you want to be at, if you're 30 frames a second, you want to be 1/60. If you're 60 frames per second, you want to be 1/20, etc. So that's where you want to be with all of that. And one last thing I want to mention about frame rates is that I do keep saying 25 frames per second for Europe, but I do know a lot of filmmakers do use 24 frames a second, or even for their more corporate or promotional work, they will still do 24 frames per second even in Europe, because 24 frames per second, of course, is was the standard for films. And it, you know, when you go to the cinema and you watch films, a lot of the time they are shot in 24 frames per second, and the eyes are sort of used to that. A lot of filmmakers started shooting in higher frame rates as time went on, but I think most films are still pretty much kept at 24 frames per second. And the other thing to keep in mind about these frame rates, so when I say 24 frames per second, it is actually technically 23.98 frames per second. And when I say 30 frames per second, it is technically 29.98 frames per second. But cameras just, when you see 24 or 30, that's what it actually means. But it's just an easier way, because who wants to see, oh, I'm on 23.98 frames per second. No one wants to keep saying that. So people will keep saying I'm on 24 frames per second, or they will say I'm on 30 frames per second. Okay, so the fifth topic or camera function we're going to go through today that is very important if you're a beginner videographer to know and familiarize yourself with is white balance. So white balance is quite important. Now, a lot of beginner videographers or photographers, they tend to do auto white balance. Now, that can be okay, especially outdoors. If you do auto white balance, that can work quite all right, because outside the sort of exposure from the sun, or if it's a cloudy day, whatever, the exposure outdoors tends to be pretty equal. But when you're sort of indoors, this can change. And if you're on auto white balance, then this can really, you might pan your camera, for example, from one bit of a room to another, and it sort of starts going a bit more yellowy or a bit more green or whatever. The color temperature tends to change. So anyways, I digress about auto white balance. You can do it, you can get away with it, but I would say you don't. So white balance basically is making sure you get the correct white color in your image. So a lot of people, they use a white sheet, and there is a function in your camera where you sort of say to the camera, can you please capture this white color, and can you make it as correctly white as possible? So whatever location you're in, whether it's outdoor or whether it's indoor, you tend to usually check the white balance first and make sure it's white, and then you know that your colors are as correct as they can be, because the color of white is as correct as it can be. Now, when it comes to outdoors, technically speaking, your color temperature should be at 5,600 Kelvin. So that's when it's sunny, 5,600 is usually around the correct place, and that is what we call daylight. So 5,600 K is the Kelvin for daylight. It's the correct setting. Now, sometimes though, you might think, oh yeah, daylight looks quite good. You go shoot with daylight indoors, and suddenly it's looking a lot more yellow or a lot more green or whatever, a lot more red than you thought it would look. And that's because indoors, artificial lights tend to be quite yellowy sometimes. There are some that are white and you'll be fine. Or if you're shooting through a window, so not shooting through a window, if you get light coming through a window, it tends to be daylight, so that will match pretty well. But say you're in a room where there's a lot of fluorescent light tubes or a lot of artificial light that is a bit more yellow, if you're shooting with daylight, then your subject or your shot will be a bit more yellow than what you want. So always make sure you check on your camera your white balance, that way your colors come out as simple as possible. And finally, the sixth topic that I wanted to discuss today is resolution. Now this is quite important as well, because your resolution can determine a few things, or it can help you out later in the edit depending on how high your resolution was. Now strictly speaking, I would say HD is the minimum resolution you want to be shooting at with these days, because that is the resolution is good enough there to be able to even zoom in on it in the edit a bit and still get good clarity and still share it, and it's quite nice. While if you shoot anything lower than HD, then it's not as great. So HD, the resolution of HD is 1920 by 1080 pixels. That is the normal resolution for HD, for high definition as it's called. And obviously TVs in recent years have also gone into Ultra HD, or what you call 4K. In fact, a lot of TVs that are said to be 4K are actually more Ultra HD than they are 4K. So why is it important then that sometimes you shoot in higher resolutions? And there's cameras like the Red cameras or the Aries or whatever that go way higher into that. And in fact, some of the newer DSLRs from Canon, for example, they even go up to 8K, which is a crazy amount of resolution. And it takes so much of your storage of your card that I never really recommend shooting that unless you're doing really serious work, you've got big budgets, and you've got all the time in the world to do what you want, and you're fine. Most of the time, you probably want to be shooting around HD or 4K resolution. So 4K resolution basically is 4 times the resolution that HD is. So here are some resolutions for you to know. So as we said, HD is sort of 1920 by 1080 pixels. 2K resolution is 2048 by 1152 pixels. Now 4K is said to be 4 times the resolution of full HD. So 4K is in fact 4096 by 2160 pixels. Right? Now, some TVs, as I said, say they're 4K, but actually they're more Ultra HD. Now, Ultra HD is 3840 pixels by 2160 pixels. And why is this a bit different? And why do we sometimes do 4K, sometimes do Ultra HD? Well, Ultra HD keeps to the 16:9 ratio that TVs have. And also Full HD, which is 1920 by 1080, also has the 16:9 ratio, right? While when it comes to 4K, actual real 4K, it's 4096 by 2160, which is a bit wider than 16:9. So that is why a lot of TVs are Ultra HD, even though they say they're 4K. So why would you want to shoot in 4K sometimes? You'd want to shoot in 4K because you can actually crop into a 4K image and get to a more sort of closer shot of something, or a more zoomed in shot, and not lose your resolution if you're working in a timeline that is HD. So shooting in higher resolutions, even though you mean to export in lower resolutions, can help basically give you more coverage. So guys, that is pretty much the end of this episode. I really hope you learn from it. I really hope you enjoyed. If you do have any questions, please feel free to put them down in the comments section. Please do subscribe, like, and hit the bell icon, as I would love to grow this channel a lot more. And there is so much more to come in the near future. We're going to talk about lighting, we'll talk about how to shoot on your iPhone, and I've even got some really great hacks for you, how you can do things on the cheap or cheaper if you don't have bigger budgets. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you next time on Show Don't Tell.